The Pearl Harbor bombing started on December 7, 1941 at around 8 a.m. Japanese planes flew across the island of Oahu deploying bombs as a surprise, unexpected attack. The U.S. military was not aware of this happening. The Japanese planes damaged the Pacific Fleet ships, caused the military to lose airships, leading to about 2,400 sailors and American soldiers' lives being taken. In addition, more than 50 civilians died that day. The attack angered the American people, and the Congress declared war on Japan and their allies, Germany and Italy. And so the United States had entered World War II.
We chose to interview Jane Kurahara, who was living on Oahu as a child when Pearl Harbor was attacked. This is her story.
I'm Jane Kurahara, and I am a volunteer here at the Japanese Cultural Center for over 20 years. I'm one of the few, I guess, now that was alive during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I was 10 years old at that time, and I understand you're interested in that era, and I can share with you what I remember through the eyes of a 10-year-old.
So what do you remember from the day of the attack?
But the day of the attack was a Sunday, and usually our family, my mom would let us sleep in, and I was trying to sleep in, but it was very noisy. It was like boom, boom, boom. So finally I got up to find out why all that noise. And my parents were just bent over the radio, no TV in those days, just radio. And they were just listening to the radio. And so I started to listen too. And then I could hear the announcer saying, "This is the real thing. This is war. We're being bombed."
Admiral Yamamoto, who directed the attack, knew how important naval air power was. With aircrafts, the U.S. could stop Japan from controlling the Western Pacific. People living on Oahu responded quickly with nurses, doctors, firefighters, and police officers all reporting for duty.
During that morning, we lived up in the valley toward Nuuanu, and so, kind of far away from Pearl Harbor. But later we found out that people at Pearl Harbor, although they were surprised, they were trying to hit the Zero planes with the anti-aircraft guns, but they were in such a hurry that they couldn't calibrate it correctly. And so what started to happen is that these anti-aircraft shells were falling on civilian neighborhoods, and some of the civilians actually got killed. One was particularly close to our house, and it was really loud. And my brother, who was only 5 years old, burst out in tears, and he was crying and crying, and we were just terrified.
People were supposed to stay in their houses because of the recent events of the Pearl Harbor bombing. The police forces under military orders went around encouraging people to stay inside their homes.
And then in the afternoon, it got very quiet, and so my father decided he saw our neighbors outside, so he wanted to go out and talk to them too. And so he went out, and I sneaked along with him, and we met our next door neighbor, who was Mr. Gomes, and Mr. Gomes said, "Oh, some shrapnel on his porch he found." And then Mr. Ishikawa, who was across the street, said, "Oh, the shrapnel came through his wall." And so we were talking about that. My dad was about to talk when this car drove up and parked right by it, near us. And this tall, to me, at 10 years old, a tall policeman came out and with a big rifle. And I was hiding behind my father because he came straight toward us. And then he finally stopped in front of us, and he said, "What are you guys doing out here?" And we said, "Oh, we're neighbors. We're just talking about what happened this morning." And he says, "Don't you know there might be paratroopers landing in the valley? Get inside your house and don't come out, and don't talk to anyone."
Jane talks about how, at the time, right after the bombing, there were rumors about paratroopers in the valley and a possible invasion now that Japan had attacked the island.
So even the Governor Poindexter, the military told him, if we get invaded, what are you going to do? You're the civilian governor. And he knew he couldn't really do anything. He says, we're here to protect you, but we need to put you under martial law. And the governor says that means he wasn't going to have any power anymore. It would all go to the military. And he hesitated for a while. He didn't know what to do. And they said, hey, if they land and they invade, it's all up to you. And then then he signed and he said, okay, we're under martial law.
Poindexter, governor of Hawaii at the time, thought that martial law would only last a few months, but the power wasn't returned to the people until 1944.
The whole of Hawaii was under martial law for 3 years. And what that meant was the military had power over the courts. If you show, they put out a regulation, everybody has to have a blackout. You can't show any light. And then you have to be in your house by a certain time or else you be arrested. And so they were arresting people whether light was showing or they were out on the streets, went beyond the time they should be. And most of them, I read later, in that first year, most of them were found guilty. About 90%, 95%, something like that, were found guilty. And you have no recourse. You can't appeal or anything. You're just guilty.
4 hours after the attack, at about noon, Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Joseph Poindexter to declare martial law. Every person living on the island had to be fingerprinted and needed identification papers on their person. And because habeas corpus was inactive in Hawaii, people could be arrested, jailed, and couldn't be tried for jury.
Martial law lasted until October 24, 1944, with President Roosevelt's proclamation ending it. 3 military generals governed the island and issued orders, which then became laws throughout the newspaper.
We couldn't go back to school for a couple of months because the military took over our school and they were using it for the engineers. And so our school had to find other places to teach at. And finally, after a couple of months, my parents were told, okay, we can open school again. And your daughter is going to be in the school, in the house that's, I don't know if you know Manoa at all. Do you know Manoa? You know where the fire station is? It's the house, I found out later, it's the house right behind it. That was our 6th grade class.
Because of gas rationing, Jane had to take the bus to school.
And that's what the bus did. It went all through town, picking up kids who were waving the yellow cloth. And we were the last house, and we'd get off there.
Jane spent the rest of her 6th grade year in a then new UH building, and in 7th grade she was taught in the West Hall, which is right next to ULS.
One thing I remember we were all told to be was patriotic, and especially the ones Japanese ancestry. And we didn't know that some people were being interned, being picked up. We didn't know that. But then they let us know in the neighborhoods where we were, it would be patriotic for you to volunteer to do something. And so some people volunteered to become block wardens, and they would go around in the dark, and if they saw a crack of light coming out of your house, they'd tell you, you got to do something about that. Or if you were a violator, then they would, arrest you.
Her father became a volunteer firefighter, and her mother and her friends knit blankets for the Red Cross.
Jane talks about how her perspective as a kid was very different from what the adults saw. She remembers in 6th grade her teacher had none of the resources to teach that were back at the school, and her class would learn in creative ways. That time was the most fun Jane ever had in school.
The whole family got together and they decided that we should make a bomb shelter, and it should be at our house because we were the most secluded. And so every weekend they'd come and we built a bomb shelter. But none of the kids would go and play in there because they knew why I was there. And, so not through words, but through actions, we knew something very bad was going on. But she came running over to me and she said, we won the Battle of Midway. She was so excited because she knew then that we would not get invaded because America won that battle.
After the Battle of Midway, which was in June 1942, some questioned the need for martial law because Hawaii was no longer in danger.
Jane explains how there was a labor shortage after so many of the men went to war and how she and her classmates helped out in the pineapple fields.
They decided that the kids would help. So we went to school 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week we went to the pineapple fields and we worked. We all had to carry gas masks, everybody, and even the babies had bunny masks. And I found a picture of, I must have been about 11 or 12 there, as a Girl Scout there. I'm carrying the gas mask.
Two of her cousins went to fight in Europe, and she wrote letters to them. One of her cousins had the job of driving, and he was going to be sent home but was killed a few days before he got back.
Jane says that the pandemic reminded her of the time of World War II and that she had hoped that Hawaii would get through the pandemic like the way it got through the war.
So do you remember feeling scared or excited during the whole event?
Very, very scared initially, and especially um, until the Battle of Midway, when we knew we would not be invaded. I think we were all, as young as we were, we knew that if we were invaded, it would be a very different kind of life for us. Yeah.
We know there was a lot of discrimination after the attack against Asians.
Mm-hmm.
So did you or your family ever experience any of that discrimination?
Um, I'm not sure if I experienced that discrimination or if it was a different kind of discrimination, but I noticed a difference at school. Up through the 6th grade, we used to go to each other's birthday parties, we'd play together, no problem. And then somehow from 7th grade on, there's a little bit of a difference with some of the kids, and I noticed um, that this person had invited me to her birthday party, but now when I go down the hall and she's coming down the hall, she ignores me. It's like I'm not even there. And I thought, how come? But then with the war and everything, I didn't figure it out till I was in college and I was taking sociology, that maybe it was a little bit of discrimination there. Um, but it was slight, very slight. And some of my other Japanese and American friends didn't experience it. So it affected some people deeply because now that I'm volunteering at the Japanese Cultural Center and I talk to the internee descendants, it affected them very deeply. And perhaps even more so because there were only 1,300 interned. And so when the arrests were selective like that, the rest of the Japanese population too would shun them because some of them would say, even though you're my friend, I don't want to get too close to you because you got arrested, and if they find out I'm your friend, they might arrest me too. And so they were shunned for that. Others shunned those who were arrested because they said, um, you must have done something wrong. Why did they arrest you and not me? And so the few that were arrested here suffered as UH Professor Noel Kent said, they were like sacrificial lambs. They were suffered a great deal for the rest of us.
The military governors changed the way Japanese Americans lived. They controlled people's working hours, didn't allow people to quit their jobs, and controlled the prices of rent, wages, food, liquor, and gasoline. Inter-island traveling was monitored, and they kept track of who had guns and ammunition. Calls were always listened to by a third party. Letters and newspapers were censored, so the people didn't know much about what was going on with the war. Beginning on the day of the attack, the military enforced curfew times and a blackout. From 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., people stayed inside and covered their windows with layers of curtains and blankets. This continued until July 1945.
When President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 in 1942, Americans of Japanese ancestry were taken to internment camps. There were many camps on the mainland, and Hawaii had Camp Honouliuli and a temporary camp on Sand Island that the leaders of the Japanese community were taken to.
In shame, many Japanese people destroyed anything Japanese-related like family artifacts, avoided speaking their language, and gave up Japanese ceremonies in response to fear and hostility. After the bombing, the military sent Japanese Americans to internment camps because they were accused of conspiring with Japan. In the end, no Japanese Americans were caught helping Japan.
And so the Pearl Harbor attack left a lasting effect on the Japanese Americans. In 1988, the Congress passed the proclamation Civil Liberties Act. The Congress apologized and gave the Japanese $200,000 in reparations.
Pearl Harbor left a huge impact on life on Oahu for Japanese Americans. We should remember this time as a learning experience so that no one goes through this devastating time again. We would also like to thank Jane Kurahara from the Japanese Cultural Center for her time so that we could create this video.